pass for William. Daniels for the win. It's gone. LSU does it. Directing receivers, flips it to the end zone. Caught. Touchdown. Marvin Harrison Jr. making a huge impact.
Here's Edwards with the lay. Donovan Edwards down the sideline. Gets past Ransom. Donovan Edwards. Touchdown, Michigan.
Welcome into the Week 4 College Fantasy Football Show. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site. And look, there's a lot to get into. Theme of the show this week, buy, sell, hold. Which players, from a college fantasy standpoint, are we buying right now after 4 weeks? And really, if you include week 0, 5 weeks of the 2023 season, which players are we selling and which players are we holding? You know, I've got a list to cover quite a few players. I sent a question into the CFF site Discord for some questions from you guys as well. I'm going to address those at the end of the show. And look, I do have quite a few names. It's probably not going to be as many as you think, but I've got a good 6, 7 names for every, buy, sell, hold column that we're going to address. And we're just going to kind of talk and start off with general college football, mainly just speaking at the top and some of the teams on who are they? Because, you know, are they who we thought they were? Are they not? Are they contenders? Are they pretenders? Because that does matter, you know, as we get into, week 5 coming up now. There's going to be some players that we're going to talk about, maybe some questions that I address about their value. And you do have to look at how good some of the teams are. You do, if we're talking about players on a 1-3 team, maybe 1-4 after week 5, you start wondering if there's going to be some, turnover in the depth chart. You start worrying about whether or not guys are just going to, take some time off if they get nicked up. There's going to be some players that we're going to talk about that's going to be in those situations. I even mentioned last week with some offenses that seemed dead to us, particularly Houston, where they went ahead and, they changed the depth chart a little bit, ran out another running back this week, and all of a sudden that guy's, at the top of the waiver wire this week. And will we see some of those players come out week in and week out now as we get into some of these future weeks, 5, 6, 7, and 8? And the answer is going to be yes. We see it every year. That's what makes the waiver wire so valuable, particularly for you guys in those redraft leagues. And we're going to see if we can address some of those names. But let's talk about some of those teams, because last week we talked about the Alabamas, to Houston's, where we were having concerns on offense. And so let's just look at college football in general, because, we learned a lot this past week, right? Colorado went up to Oregon with all that hype. I thought it was a little bit smoke and mirrors leading up to this point. You can't take away anything that Colorado has accomplished up until this point. But, this past Saturday, that was kind of that was who we thought they were going into the season. I think we've gotten more out of Colorado up to this point. And look, the Pac-12, when you look at some of the teams they're going to play Stanford, right? They're going to play Arizona State. There's going to be some other games where they're really going to be able to run up some yards and some points. But, you have another one this weekend. They've got a home game against USC. The one thing that I'll say is that USC's defense hasn't been too great. It's like USC wants to score a lot of points. So let's see how Colorado fares out this weekend. But Colorado did come back down to earth. And really just looking at the top, you had that matchup between Notre Dame and Ohio State, Clemson, Florida State. I said, a couple of weeks ago that Florida State looked like they had everything and, at the time to make a run. I still believe that they are really good and can make a run at that college football playoff and make a run at the title. I think Washington's really starting to make a name for themselves now. That offense just looks so electric and so efficient right now with the weapons that they have, with Michael Penix running the show. Penn State's right there as well. Florida State, Ohio State, Texas, the top 3. Texas is probably the one team I think that I'm more concerned about being in the top 7 right now than any of the teams, even though they beat Alabama. Alabama just doesn't seem to be that good. I worry about whether or not Texas is going to be able to stay up there. But when you look at the top 10, all teams legit. Oregon there, Utah's there. Cam Rising hasn't come back. Notre Dame at 11. I think once when you get outside the top 10, Notre Dame at 11, I think is still in it. And I think LSU at 13 are still in it. I'm not a big believer that Alabama is going to be there at the end. And I'm not a big believer in Oklahoma. I was, particularly bringing up Dylan Gabriel because they ran through that non-conference slate. I was a little worried that he'd come back down to earth once when they hit some of the conference games. Still had a good game there against Cincinnati, but it seemed like Cincinnati was really in a position to win that game. They just really, really faltered on offense, particularly in Oklahoma side of the of the field in that game, and they were just terribly inefficient. I thought they were good enough to beat Oklahoma. Oklahoma's in there. I don't really think that they're going to make a strong run. And I think North Carolina, Washington State, Duke. I mean, obviously Duke's got the game with Notre Dame coming up. Washington State, the big win over Oregon State. So they're going to stay alive. And as long as North Carolina can stay unbeaten, I think they're still going to be in it. So, when you look outside the top 10, like I mentioned, I think Notre Dame, LSU pretty strong. Oklahoma with a shot, North Carolina with a shot, Washington State with a shot, Duke with a shot. But past those teams, I think everybody that's in the top 10, those are going to be the teams that we're going to see emerge in this college football playoff. So that's my thoughts on just the college football landscape in general. Look, we've got to start talking about maybe some Heisman stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks too. So as these numbers start running up, these stats start piling up for some of these players, we'll maybe get into that discussion too. But before we take a lot of questions from the Discord, which a lot of you guys sent some questions in, I think we've got probably a good, 8 to 10 questions coming in from the Discord that I'm going to address. I mentioned the theme of the show was buy, sell, hold. So let's kind of go there. Let's start off with some of the buys. And I think some of these are going to be fairly easy. Some of them are going to be obvious, but I think for some of you all that are looking to grab some of these guys, maybe in some shallow leagues, need a little bit more affirmation on your gut feeling. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to do that for you here. So let's just start off with Emmanuel Michel, right? The fullback over at Air Force. Look, 2 straight weeks, monster games. You look at that game against San Jose State, 33 carries, 148 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then Utah State, 28 carries, 106, 3 touchdowns. He is the guy that's taken over that fullback role. Remember, that is the spot to have in that Air Force offense. There was a lot of questions that we had going into the season, whether or not John Lee Eldridge would take over that fullback spot. John Lee Eldridge had a great game this past weekend, good statistical game, but that spot is Emmanuel Michel's, and he is going to be really solid to have in that fullback spot for Air Force. So I'm certainly buying him. Another play I was a little hesitant on at the beginning of the year because he came out of the gate really strong with that 197-yard rushing performance against St. Francis. And that was Western Kentucky running back Jalen Buckley, right? He followed up that 197-yard opener with an 87-yard performance against Syracuse. And really, he had a run early in the game that went the distance for a touchdown, and then he was shut down the rest of the game. So I really wasn't quite buying him then. Then he only ran for 30 yards that following week 3 in that game against Iowa. But look, all of a sudden now, Western Kentucky in MAC play and in the MAC opener against Toledo, 29 carries, 190 yards, 2 touchdowns. Jalen Buckley does need to be on a roster. Completely buying him. Let's stick in the MAC. Another player that I think we have to buy right now, and that's Penny Boone. And I think we're considering the circumstances on this. Let's look at Penny Boone. He had that 3 touchdown performance in the opener against Texas Southern. He only had 6 carries in that game for 39 yards. But in the last 2 games against San Jose State, he had 13 carries for 123 yards. And then this past weekend against Western Michigan, 24 carries, 211 yards, 2 touchdowns. And why is he a buy? Well, right now, Daquan Finn, we know he went down with an injury in the last game. We do not know the severity of that injury, but right now, I have to say the injury didn't look good for Daquan Finn. So if he is out for an extended period of time, that puts Tucker Gleason back there behind center. He can move a little bit, but he's not Daquan Finn. And with the emergence of Penny Boone at running back, he can be a real important fantasy asset for you over the next couple of weeks in that Toledo offense as the Rockets get into MAC play. Another player I'm buying right now after watching him for a couple of weeks is Boston College quarterback Thomas Castellano. He has a rushing touchdown in 3 of 4 games this year. He has thrown for at least 2 touchdowns in 3 of 4 games this year. That dual threat ability, he's racking up the rushing yards. I think he's an absolute must buy in that offense. Remember, he did that in a game against Florida State, which is going to be one of the better defenses he's going to face all year. So I do believe Thomas Castellano is a buy. Another player that I really am impressed with, I mentioned this in my notes and observations, is Braden Fowler-Nicolosi. I said on last week's show that I thought that he was overshadowed in that Colorado win against Colorado State last weekend because all of the hype was around Colorado. I really liked the way that Fowler-Nicolosi looked in that offense. I love the way that he connected with his wide receiver, Torrey Horton. He had another good performance this past weekend against Middle Tennessee. He's thrown for over 300 yards in his last 2 games. And another reason why I'm buying him as well is when you look at the schedule coming up over the next few weeks, talking about that short-term payoff and why you're buying him. You've got, I believe he's got Utah Tech coming up, followed by Utah State. They do get a game in there against Boise. But then UNLV. So 3 of the next 4 matchups are favorable, which is why I'm buying right now Colorado State quarterback Braden Fowler-Nicolosi. And I'm going to follow it up with one more on the buy. And we're going to stay in the Mountain West Conference because I think Jayden Thomas, running back UNLV, I'm buying him right now. I do have him, picked him up after that week 1 game against Bryant when he ran for 2 touchdowns, 60 yards on 8 carries. And yes, it was only Bryant, but you just had a feeling that somebody was going to emerge as that UNLV top running back. And so I read the tea leaves early on that, knowing that UNLV had a game on deck with Michigan. He had 5 carries for 1 yard in that game. But when you look at his last 2 games, 13 carries, 50 yards and a touchdown against Vanderbilt. And then this past weekend, 13 carries, 100 yards, 4 touchdowns in that game against UTEP. And when you look at the schedule, we just did this with Fowler-Nicolosi. When you look at that schedule for UNLV over the next few weeks, you've got a game against Hawaii. There is a bye week, and then they get matchups against Nevada and Colorado State. So 3 of the next 4 weeks, you could be possibly starting Jayden Thomas for UNLV. So that's a short list of the buys that I have going into week 5. Let's take a look at the sells. And I think some of these are pretty easy too, and some of them may be judgment calls. But look, we've got to start with Grayson McCall, quarterback, Coastal Carolina. He's only accounted for 1 touchdown in all 3 games in which Coastal Carolina has played an FBS opponent. Nowhere near what we were expecting from Grayson McCall, nowhere near what he was over the last couple of years. And in my opinion, 1 touchdown in 3 games against FBS opponents, no more than 1 touchdown in each of those 3 games. For me right now, Grayson McCall is a sell. Here's a tough one, a real tough one, because high hopes at the beginning of the year for this one. And this still could pay off. And if you want to hold, you hold. I get it. I completely understand because the talent's there. Michigan running back Donovan Edwards, 0 touchdowns this year. 109 rushing yards, 100 receiving yards in 4 games, 209 yards of total offense. He's only averaging 50 yards a game. He's not finding the end zone. And for me, redraft leagues, non-keeper, Donovan Edwards for me right now, an easy sell. The only way that I'm probably holding Edwards right now is I have depth on my roster and I'm sitting on Blake Corum right now and I'm using him as my insurance policy. That may be the only way that I'm holding on to Donovan Edwards right now. Jarquez Hunter, running back, Auburn. Remember, he was, missed that first game, whether or not it was suspension. We would all assume that it would be. 1 touchdown this year. He's had fewer than 55 rushing yards in all 3 games in which he's played. And that Auburn offense just doesn't look that good. And that showed in this past weekend's matchup at Texas A&M, where the defense for Auburn outscored the offense with a defensive touchdown. Another one that's tough because I mentioned at the beginning of the year about the SMU schedule. And right now for me, Jalen Knighton is a sell. I mean, when you look at the 3 games, zero touchdowns against TCU, 842-0. Oklahoma, he went for 1576-0, and that's the game that really made me optimistic. 17 for 64 in that opener against Louisiana Tech. I'm just not seeing any efficiency right now in that SMU offense. I could make a case to put him in the hold column, but for me right now, for some of you guys that are really struggling or have gotten out of the gate really slow, I don't know how long you can sit on a guy like Jalen Knight when there's other guys out there floating on the waiver wire that you can pick up that right now is paying instant dividends. Like we just mentioned, Jaden Thomas from UNLV, 7 touchdowns this year, Jalen Knight and 0. Here's another one. This is tough because this is a guy that some people were just buying recently, but I'm not sure that I'm on board. And I think I'm a sell on this guy right now. But LJ Martin, running back BYU, I'm not completely all in on him. I know there was a matchup against Kansas, but look, I'm not saying that Kansas doesn't necessarily have a shutdown defense. 11 carries for 28 yards, no touchdowns against Kansas. Remember in that game against Arkansas, 23 carries for 77 yards and 2 touchdowns. The yards per carry average just isn't there for any BYU running backs. I think this is a problem that goes far beyond the running backs. Aiden Robbins, the transfer from UNLV, didn't have any success there. LJ Martin had some early success. I'm just not seeing any chunk plays from that BYU offense, particularly in the running game. And for me, I'm not feeling LJ Martin long-term. And for me, he's a sell. I want to move off on somebody that I think has a higher ceiling. Here's another tough one. Ja'Quinden Jackson, running back Utah. Right now, I think that he is a sell more than a hold. And he's been banged up, trying to play through injury, and he's been toughing it out, and he's been there. But from a fantasy aspect, and really from a production standpoint, he's not really given that offense anything. If there's any reason why he's a hold right now, and this is just something to keep out there, if you have the room to hold him, is that in week 6, Utah gets a bye. And you have to hope that he comes out of that bye week getting healed and healthy. Maybe Utah gets Cam Rising back. The offense takes it to another level. I think if you have Ja'Quinden Jackson, that's your last hope, is that get into that bye week, try to get him healthy and see if he's healthy enough for them to feed him the ball in that offense. If they cannot feed him and he's not getting 15 to 20 carries a game, he's not worth holding on to. And for some of you guys, we're 4 weeks into the season. That bye week isn't until week 6. The regular season in your fantasy leagues is going to be more than half over at that point. How much longer can you continue to take a hit in that roster spot? And for me, in most formats, Ja'Quinden Jackson is a sell right now. Here's another one. High hopes in the preseason. And I expressed my doubt about this offense, but mentioned that this guy probably had the highest ceiling in the offense amongst the receiving core, but it's just not there. And I said a couple of weeks ago that even in my notes and observations, if I had to have one player in the Tennessee offense, it's just Joe Milton. Not that Joe Milton was all world, but his dual threat ability in that Josh Heupel offense is going to pay dividends for fantasy owners. But Squirrel White, wide receiver, Tennessee. Let's go run down his numbers in the 4 games. 6 catches, 45 yards, 4 catches, 30 yards, 3 catches, 68 yards, 4 catches, 29 yards, no touchdowns. He's simply not giving you anything right now. And I think for me, Squirrel White is an absolute sell right now. There's just too many players out there giving you too many players emerging out there. The Gage Larvadane's out there. Too many other players giving you too good numbers to even sit on a guy and wait for that Tennessee offense. We've seen them now for 4 weeks. I think what you see is what you're going to get. I'm not expecting Tennessee to vastly improve between now and the end of the year. I think what we see is what we get is who they are. And for me, Squirrel White, wide receiver, Tennessee, is a sell coming out of week 4. DeCorian Clark, UTSA. This is really hard because I was really high on DeCorian Clark. I think he's got a lot of potential, and I think he's an NFL caliber wide receiver. But right now with Frank Harris out, they lose Zachary Franklin. That offense isn't what they were. and isn't what we expect them to be. And right now he's got one catch, I believe, all year. And here's a situation where we get into with DeCorian Clark. UTSA now, they look like they're going to struggle this year. Their record's not too good. This is a guy that possibly could be playing on Sundays or will get a tryout somewhere, will get in the draft. Does he try to come back and play after having that leg injury last year? Or is this somebody that he kind of takes his time coming back, works his way in, gets some reps during the season, and just starts healing himself for some type of an NFL draft? That's what I worry with DeCorian Clark. I think right now he's a drop. I think you've got to sell him. If he emerges late in the year, then I think you've just got to acknowledge it. But right now you're getting nothing from that roster spot right now, and you've got to cut bait with DeCorian Clark. I've got two more names on the list I'm going to run down right here, and this is another tough one. Samson Evans, running back, Eastern Michigan. And this one might be tough for some of you guys, because when you look at Samson Evans, last year, 224 carries for 1,084 yards and 13 touchdowns. I believe he did that in 11 games last year. Now, he hasn't done much at all this year. In 4 games, 38 carries, 220 yards rushing, and a single touchdown. He's way off of last year's pace. Now, we did get whispers and rumors coming out of spring that he might have been injured or dinged up. He seems okay now that we've seen, that Eastern Michigan is playing, but I wonder if there is some sort of lingering issue because they're not feeding the ball the way that they fed him last year. And for me, right now, from what we've seen through 4 weeks of Eastern Michigan, I don't think you can afford to hold on to Samson Evans anymore. I think you've got to cut bait, move on, and pick up a waiver wire gem. And then here's one more name. And I think this one's tough because the offense is doing things. And I think depending on the situation that you're in, you can move off of this guy. But Ashton Hawkins was projected to be our top receiver in that Texas State offense. And while Texas State is really kind of, figuring it out right now with TJ Finley at quarterback, I just feel that they're spreading the ball around way to too many people right now. And I'm not sure Ashton Hawkins is really going to fulfill. As a matter of fact, I almost feel positive that he's not going to really fulfill that top spot that you're looking for like a really top-notch fantasy receiver in an offense that could be very productive under G.J. Kinney. When you look at Hawkins' stats right now, he doesn't have 60 yards receiving in any of the 4 games this year, 17 catches, only a single touchdown. And for me, Texas State receiver Ashton Hawkins is a sell. So that takes care of the buy. It takes care of the sell. Well, what about hold? Who are we holding right now? Because there's a lot of names that we can be holding right now. Rooms on roster. Here's the thing, and I send this out to emails, and I try to. It's almost like a public service announcement once a year when I get into this. A lot of who you buy, sell, and hold really depends on where you're at, right? You could be 4-0 in a head-to-head format league right now, and some of the names that I mentioned to sell, you may be willing to hold on to a Jaquindon Jackson because you're sitting 4-0 and you've got so much quality depth on there, you can afford to hold him till later in the year, right? Same thing can be said for a team that's 1-3 right now, 0-4. There's not a lot of patience. You cannot afford to take a hit. At this point, if you're 1-3, there's just not too many games that you're going to be able to afford to lose and still possibly make the college fantasy playoffs in your league. You've got to move on. So a lot of these recommendations of buy, sell, hold will really depend on how well you're doing right now in your league. And so let's look at some of those names from a hold. Trey Benson, running back, Florida State right now. When you look at his numbers, nothing great, right? In the opener against LSU, 12 carries, 47 yards. Against USM, that following week, 9 carries, 79 yards, 3 touchdowns. Okay, high hopes moving forward. And then that game against BC, 12 carries, 38 yards, and a touchdown. Scored a touchdown. The yardage, right? Ho-hum. And then this past weekend against Clemson, 7 carries, 25 yards. And look, I just mentioned, I think Florida State has the goods. I think they can go a long way. I do think they're going to figure some things out in the running game. They have to if they're going to be serious contenders. I do think Trey Benson is a hold right now. You've got to have a little patience. I just think Florida State right now is too good to jump off of their running back one going into week 5. Another name on the hold list, and this one's dangerously close to a sell for me, is Preston Stone, quarterback SMU. I already mentioned Jalen Knighton for me was a sell. I think Preston Stone right now is a hold. We got to remember, he had those 5 touchdowns in that game against Prairie View A&M. He threw for 3 touchdowns against Louisiana Tech. But in that matchup against Oklahoma, 1 touchdown, and he did not have a touchdown pass in this past weekend's game against TCU. There really just doesn't seem to be any established go-to receiver in that offense. And the only reason I think Preston Stone is a hold right now, because we mentioned this in the preseason on how juicy that schedule looked for SMU. They're coming out of these 2 matchups against Oklahoma and TCU. Let's see if things can turn around for SMU. But I think week 5 and week 6 are going to be really telling for Preston Stone and his fantasy appeal the rest of the way. But for me right now, Preston Stone is a hold, but he's trending towards a sell really fast. I think Marquez Cooper, running back, Ball State, is a hold. I think this was one that was a little painful for me to put on here because I'm super high on Marquez Cooper, and I still have high hopes for him moving into MAC play. But 9 carries for 16 yards, and the offense looked terrible. They were routed this past weekend against Georgia Southern. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to the Georgia Southern defense, which has at least looked decent so far this year. Remember, Cooper was coming off of that 22-carry, 177-yard touchdown performance against Indiana State 2 weeks ago. But they opened the season against Georgia and Kentucky, so I wasn't really judging him off of those 2 games. I thought that Indiana State game would really springboard the rest of the season, not only for him, for that Ball State offense. Let's see if this game against Georgia Southern was a hiccup, a bump in the road. Let's see if they could turn it on for MAC play. Marquez Cooper right now for me a hold, but really he's got to get some things, and that offense has to get some things figured out quickly. But there's a lot of potential in that offense if they're going to continue to feed the ball to Marquez Cooper as long as they're in the game. Staying in the MAC, and another big one, Say Bangura, running back, Ohio. Right now, he is a hold, but the last 2 weeks, 9 carries, 26 yards against Bowling Green, 14 carries for 44 yards against Iowa State. We weren't expecting much in that game against Iowa State, but he's got 0 rushing touchdowns this year. And I think the most discouraging thing right now is that O'Shan Allison, his teammate O'Shan Allison, is actually getting more work and more carries in that Ohio backfield. Is there something going on that we don't know about? I refuse to believe that O'Shan Allison is a more talented back than Say Bangura. I'm wondering if there's some other issues going on, maybe from health, but it's very discouraging right now that Say Bangura, who we had as a top 10 fantasy running back going into the season, is now going into MAC play and really opens up MAC play with a 9-carry, 26-yard performance against Bowling Green. So I think there's a lot of concern right there. I don't know if there's more going on with this, but I think you've got to be really concerned. But I still think right now, at least for another week, Say Bangura has to be a hold. I think his upside is too good in that MAC play, in that MAC conference, in the MAC. Moving forward against that competition. But I don't know if something's going on, but he's a hold right now. Say Bangura, running back, Ohio. Rodney Hammond. A lot of questions about Rodney Hammond going into last week. We got news that maybe he was a little banged up, that they were going to let him loose in this matchup against North Carolina. 14 carries, 83 yards, and a touchdown. I think some of us can live with that. Next week, Pitt gets Virginia Tech, who just gave up a huge monster rushing game to Marshall's Rasheen Ali this past weekend. If you have Rodney Hammond, I think this is the weekend you're going to want to get him in your lineup, and for sure, for me, a definite hold right now. Let's go to another one. DJ Giddens, running back, Kansas State. Just a week ago, I was talking about how quarterback Will Howard had more rushing touchdowns than both DJ Giddens and Trayshawn Ward, the Kansas State running backs combined. all of a sudden, and we talk about this in the preseason, it happened over at Boise State. George Holani goes down. All of a sudden, Ashton Jeanty projects as like a top 10, top 12 running back. Well, now Treshaun Ward goes out this past weekend. Will Howard was banged up. He was a game day decision. He plays. What happens? DJ Giddens gets fed the rock against Central Florida, 30 carries, 207 yards, 4 touchdowns. And not only that, he led the team with 8 receptions for 86 yards. And so now you have to say, okay, man, look, we knew Deuce Vaughn was going to get a heavy workload at his stature the last few years because he was proven. DJ Giddens is a little bigger, but man, he just showed he can catch 8 passes out of the backfield for 86 yards. He showed that he can shoulder this workload on offense and carry the offense on his back with him and Will Howard in there. And I just wonder, was this the week that we needed? Treshaun Ward going down, Giddens gets the full workload, and he's, of course, nobody's dropping him up until this point, but up until a week ago, there was doubts on whether or not Giddens should even be on the roster. And I would even be willing to bet there were several fantasy owners that dropped him. If you held him, he's a hold. Let's see if this performance against UCF springboards Giddens into and solidifies him into the top spot of that depth chart, but not only solidifies him in that top spot on the depth chart, really allows them to feed him more in a feature role in that offense. And that's what we're looking for. We get anywhere half of what we got this past weekend, then DJ Giddens is going to be solid gold for the rest of the year. Now, before I get into the Discord questions, let's go ahead and talk about a few teams where I think we need to be careful, right? And I just there's 3 that I want to bring up. I think Kentucky is one that we look at. You look at Kentucky's non-conference schedule. They've been able to kind of run through that. Ray Davis has been really good up until this point. I think when you look at Kentucky, they're about to get into the heart of the SEC schedule. It's going to get a little bit tougher. I just wonder what we've seen from Kentucky, if we're going to continue to see that. I think we're going to see a little bit more regression from the Kentucky offense in the coming weeks as they get into SEC play. So just a little warning there. Dillon Gabriel, quarterback, Oklahoma. I was always, non-conference schedule. I thought Oklahoma was feasting off of that. I know Mike and I had a conversation about this last week. I was curious to see what Oklahoma was going to be and who they were going to be and what they were going to do as they got into conference play. And I think last week was a week when Cincinnati actually could have taken them down. And I just wonder now, as Oklahoma gets into this Big 12 schedule, are we going to see those gaudy numbers that Dillon Gabriel put up against those non-conference opponents? I think he's going to come back down and be a little bit more, hopefully above average quarterback for you guys, but I think we'll see a little bit more average numbers from Dillon Gabriel moving forward as the Sooners get into Big 12 play. And then, of course, I think you've got to mention Tennessee. And I've mentioned them now for a couple of weeks now, where Milton is obviously, for me, the only guy that I'm really worried about. I mean, you had Sampson come in this past weekend again, crack up and open a couple of more touchdowns. So, there's just too many mouths to feed in that Tennessee offense, and they're not efficient enough for me where I think you can really rely on any player other than Joe Milton up until this point. And when you look at the future schedule for Tennessee in the coming weeks, South Carolina, followed by a bye week, followed by A&M, followed by Alabama, then Kentucky. I do think that there's reasons to be concerned, which is the reason why I say Squirrel White for me is a drop, because I'm moving on and I don't have a lot of hope for a lot of consistency for players outside of Joe Milton in that offense moving forward. So that's going to take care of the buy, sell, hold. And, let's get into a lot of questions that I got from Discord, and I'll try to bang these out for you guys. And let me go ahead and pull those up here as we get into these questions. So here we go. If Jeff Sims is healthy next week, does he start next week, or did Harburg do enough to win the job? That's at Nebraska, obviously. And I think Harburg is going to be your starter. I would have a hard time believing that Nebraska right now, coming off of 2 wins in a row, is going to go back to Sims. And I don't think they would just throw Sims back in the fire in a matchup coming up. I believe Nebraska plays Michigan this coming week. Let's see. Yeah, they play at home against Michigan. And look, if they throw Jeff Sims in that starting in that starting spot in this matchup against Michigan, let's be honest, Nebraska's probably not going to win that game, right? They throw Sims in there, he'll probably get booed out of the stadium after a few more turnovers. The guy may never want to put on another uniform again. I think if there's any hope to see Jeff Sims under center playing quarterback this year and getting any fantasy benefit from that, I think Nebraska just has to start Harburg, let him, feed him to the wolves, see what he does against Michigan. If he's able to hold his own, he's the guy the rest of the way. If he's able to kind of protect the ball and Nebraska can keep it respectable, I think he's in there. I don't think Jeff Sims throwing him in against Michigan is going to be the play. I think Harburg's going to be at least the guy for another week. We'll see how it plays out, but that's my take on that situation. That was from Bedtime 37. Now, this is from Killer Carp. I'm curious on highly drafted players that you would be willing to hold on to, willing to drop. Examples might be Benson, Cowing, Bangura, Tyron Smith, etc. So look, the good thing is, Killer Carp, I've addressed a couple of those for you already. I think Cowing for sure is definitely a hold. Tyron Smith right now for me, of the one name on that list, he's the one that I'm most afraid of, that I'd probably be off of already up at this point. This is coming in from Jay Light. Any guys who recently returned or grabbed a starting spot that you could see as a league winner or big booster in 10-team formats that are shallow? And I think you've got to, without throwing out a bunch of names, I think you really just have to take a look at some of the names that I addressed, even on the buy sell. You look at the Penny Boons. I think you even have to look at a guy like Jace Bauer at Central Michigan that may have really kind of staked his claim to the starting spot for Central Michigan. They go down and beat a South Alabama team that beat up Oklahoma State the week before. I think he probably moves and solidifies himself into that top spot and takes it over from Birdie Manuel. I know there's a lot of Birdie Manuel shares out there, so I would imagine Jace Bauer is a name that you could look at. You look at the dual threat quarterback that was thrown in against Arkansas State against Southern Miss, Jalen Rayner, dual threat. Arkansas State was basically left dead in the water, and then this guy comes in there. They score 40-something points against Southern Miss, look like a completely different offense, and you just have to wonder if a guy like that's going to really kickstart that offense. I think you have to look at a player like that in a shallow league. You have to look at a Parker Jenkins, who Houston rolled out there at running back, 20 carries, 105 yards, and 3 touchdowns against a very respectable Sam Houston State defense up until this point in the season. I thought that was pretty impressive. I think, I know Holgerson has a knack for doing this. I wouldn't be surprised to see Jenkins stick at that running back one. He'd be a guy you'd want to jump on. I mentioned Braden Fowler Nicolosi for Colorado State. I think as long as Ben Woolridge is out, a player like Zion Chris over the quarterback at Louisiana, you've got to really take a look at him from his dual threat ability as well. And then I even mentioned DJ Giddens after that breakout. I think he's going to be on the waiver wire in some leagues, because I think there's going to be some fantasy owners that jumped off of him. So Jay Light, to answer your question right there, there's a long list of names that I think you have to take a look at. You've got to be willing to take a shot on some of these guys. And look, in a 10-team format, shallow league, you've got to jump on players and jump off quick. And if just one or two of those players stick and become a core of for your roster week in and week out, you've obviously have some difference makers in that league. Now, Bobby Q Sauce comes in and says, I have 3 running backs on a bye, and Devin Neal is my only solid running back. I'm 4th in waivers. What order should I prioritize these backs? Jonah Coleman, Katron Allen, Montrell Johnson, or Nathaniel Pete. When I look at those, I think it's an easy one for me. I think you've got to prioritize Katron Allen. I think, the way that Penn State really dips into that running game, he's the one guy that I'd have more faith of. Remember, you're looking at right now, if you're talking about 3 running backs on a bye and Neal is your only solid running back, then you need someone for week 5. And so if you're going to prioritize, I don't think you're prioritizing for the rest of the year. I think you're prioritizing, if I'm reading the question right, in week 5. And in that case, I'm going with Katron Allen against Northwestern. And then if I'm doing a second back, I'd probably go with I'd probably go with Montrell Johnson with Florida at Kentucky, but you know what? That's going to be a tough matchup. And I mentioned this 2 weeks ago when Trevor Etienne, or last week when Trevor Etienne had the big game for Florida against Tennessee. I just think that Florida backfield, they're going to ride the hot hand. And you take a chance with Montrell Johnson on losing out carries to Trevor Etienne if they go against Kentucky and Etienne starts putting up a few numbers and getting the hot hand. And then I think you've got to worry about that with same thing with Missouri, right? You've got Cody Schrader there. So Nathaniel Pete's going to be playing second fiddle. And Jonah Coleman's going up against Washington next week. And look, that game could get ugly. You never know what's going to come out of that game. I think the safest bet is to jump on Katron Allen, running back Penn State, in that matchup against Northwestern, and hopefully him and Singleton can both find the end zone, pick up at least 70 yards each at the very least. And I think they're capable of doing that, if not both of them gaining 100 yards and scoring a touchdown. So that's my move, Bobby Q Sauce. Mills asks, what to do with UNC wide receiver room? Do you see John? Okay, so he goes into another one. Do you see Jonathan Brooks as the clear-cut running back one for Texas moving forward? Is Baron Morton worth adding to replace Shug moving forward? So let's talk about the UNC wide receiver room at first. I was not a big fan of jumping all in on Nate McCollum. I mentioned in last week's notes and observations that I was a little up in the air on that if that was going to stick. I've just seen it one too many times where these 1 week wonders come in. I'm not saying that Nate McCollum's not going to do it again. I just don't have a lot of faith that there's going to be consistency in that passing game. I think it was a little, I know that everybody that picked up Nate McCollum probably went all in on him last year. I do think he's going to have a lot of, I think he's going to have a lot of fantasy appeal moving forward, but I'm not expecting anywhere close to what he got 2 weeks ago. And that showed this past weekend where his numbers were a lot more pedestrian. And I think that's what you're going to see from that North Carolina passing game. You know, as long as North Carolina is in this, they've got Drake May, they got Amarian Hampton. They're gonna spread the wealth a little bit. And I don't really think you've got that go-to receiver. I think we would have had that if Devontae Walker would have been given his eligibility had been approved. But I think right now North Carolina's got to make do with what they have. And I think Walker was the best receiver on the roster. And I think they've got a lot of solid guys. I don't think there are a lot of great guys, but I do think, much like Tennessee, they're going to spread it around, but they're probably going to be a little bit better than the Tennessee wide receiver room. Do you see Jonathan Brooks as the clear-cut running back one for Texas moving forward? I don't know if I see him as the clear-cut running back one, but I do see him as the running back one. I don't think that a player like that shows you what he can do with a heavier workload and then all of a sudden takes the back seat. Again, Texas, top 5 in the nation. Their priority is not to win a Heisman with their running back like Bijan Robinson was featured last year. I think what you're going to do is their priority is going to be winning games. They're going to at times maybe ride the hot hand. But to your point, I think Brooks right now is the running back one. I just don't think you're going to see Brooks get 29 carries and Baxter get 3 or 4 in relief. I think you're going to see Brooks get most. If Baxter comes in there and gets a hot hand, I could see where he gets quite a few carries. But for me, Brooks is the running back one for now. And I think that's pretty evident up until this point. And is Baron Morton, your final question, Mills, is Baron Morton worth adding to replace Shug moving forward? I think you have to, but I do have concerns about that Texas Tech offense. Look, here's the thing. And when you look at that offense, there's not a lot happening with their receivers. And look, you've got to remember where Kitley came from over at Western Kentucky. You felt like when you watched Western Kentucky just a couple of years ago, that there were receivers in space wide open. It feels like they were getting their receivers in space with, the quarterback was making throws and they didn't have guys within 3 to 4 yards of them. That doesn't seem the case right now, where Texas Tech, there's not a lot of room to make throws right now. I don't know if there's an issue on the offensive line where there's just not a lot of protection. I don't know if it's a combination of everything where they maybe just don't have the right quarterback. Maybe Baron Morton is. It doesn't seem like it up until this point, but I think they have 2 serviceable quarterbacks. I think Shug is fine, and I think Baron Morton's fine. I just think that there's something off with this Kitley offense, and I think it goes a little bit deeper than just the receivers and the quarterback. I wonder if it's line. You start worrying about, okay, well, this scheme did well at Western Kentucky. Is it going to translate well over into against better defenses over in the Big 12. And I think it will, and I think it should. But there's something that's just not clicking right now with this Zach Kittley offense. It looks like a shell of what the offensive was when he was at Western Kentucky. And so that's my take right now with Texas Tech from what I've observed at least through 4 weeks. Bedtime 37 asks, does Max Johnson have any upside in the Texas A&M offense? Look, I don't know, Bedtime 37, how deep your league is. I don't know if you play in an SEC only league, Power 5 only, full FBS, but in a full FBS, Max Johnson, for me, no value. Power 5, Max Johnson, not a lot of value, little value. Maybe in an SEC only league, I think he carries a little bit more. That win against Auburn wasn't great. Auburn really hasn't been impressive up until this point either. A&M looks like to me that they're going to struggle a little bit too. I just feel the entire SEC is down with the exception of maybe a couple of teams. But I'm not really particularly high on Max Johnson right now. Let's see. Here's another question. How about Deion Burks for Purdue? And, if I'm putting this in a buy, sell, hold category, I'm certainly holding Deion Burks right now. I think he's got a couple of games with a touchdown. But again, I mentioned Purdue 1-3, right? They're 1-3 record after 4 weeks. When you look at the upcoming schedule of Purdue, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio State, a bye week, Nebraska, then Michigan, it doesn't look like there's a lot of easy matchups going into the heart of that Big 12 schedule. Deion Burks is a hold. I mean, how could he not be up until this point? But he very quickly could become a sell if this Purdue offense goes south quickly and they start hitting some bumps in the road against that schedule coming up. Let's see. John M87 asks about Audric Estime, Damian Martinez, Lincoln Victor, and DJ Giddens. Well, I think I've already addressed Giddens. Victor has to be a hold until we know for sure what's going on with his injury. The upside there is just too high. They're speculating maybe a high ankle sprain. That would probably put him on the shelf for at least a couple of weeks. But you've got to hold a guy that's got potential in an offense that's clicking right now. Damian Martinez, dressed him earlier in the year. My concern with Damian Martinez was that he was going to be a 1,200-yard rusher and maybe not hit more than 8 touchdowns on the season. I still have that concern with Fenwick and DJU at quarterback. I still am worried about the touchdown production. And Audric Estime over at Notre Dame, no concern there. As long as there's no injuries and there's no fumbling issues, I don't see any reason. Matter of fact, I can make a case that Notre Dame could have used him more in that matchup against Ohio State. I think you're certainly holding him. I think he's going to be a weekly starter for you. DCLA asks, what about Trevor Etienne and CJ Baxter? Those are 2 good questions. I mean, look, I addressed the Trevor Etienne question with the Montrell Johnson issue. The problem you're going to have in the Florida offense is they're going to be run heavy, particularly in games that they're very competitive in, and they're going to ride Etienne and they're going to ride Johnson, and sometimes the hot hand's going to prevail. And I said this a couple of weeks ago, sometimes that's just going to rotate week in and week out. It could be Johnson 1 week, Etienne another, could be Johnson for 2, Etienne for another. It's just the pain and the heartache that you're going to have to deal with those players, which is why it's always an issue on whether or not you should hold or sell those guys that are in those backfield. Remember, we just had the issue with Boise State that came up where Helani went down. We just had the issue come up with Kansas State where Treshaun Ward went down. What if Montrell Johnson goes down? What if Trevor Etienne goes down? All of a sudden, you're looking at each of those guys' values skyrocketing. So it's hard not to hold them right now, but the longer the season goes, the longer longer in the tooth the season becomes, and nothing's moving on that front, and you're not doing well, you've got to move off of these guys. And yeah, the risk you take is you throw them back into the waiver pool and somebody else could grab them, but you need instant gratification and instant results. And so sometimes you've got to jump off of a guy and make a calculated risk like that. And then same thing with CJ Baxter. I did address that as well when talking about Jonathan Brooks, so that should have taken care of the CJ Baxter question. And then John M87, I think, let's see. I got a bedtime 37, Jay Simpson 42. Everybody's got a number here. So John M87 asks, Quinshaw Judkins, it sucks to put him on this list. But is he, where's he at? Is he a sell? Is he a hold? Well, Judkins for me is a hold. He has to be just way too talented. We know what he saw last year. We know what he's capable of doing in that Lane Kiffin offense. I think the other thing you have to consider with Quinshaw Judkins as well is that we know that he was banged up. He was, we were told that he was questionable to doubtful a couple of weeks ago when they were playing, and then he wound up playing. So you have to, think that this guy is pushing through some sort of a nagging injury. And I'll throw this out there at you because I think this was something we mentioned with Jaquindon Jackson as well. I think you're still going to get production from Quinshaw Judkins. I mean, they're going to feed him the ball. There's just no doubt about that. They've got LSU and Arkansas coming up back-to-back weeks. I still think he can be productive in both of those games. Then they get a bye. Then after that bye, I think that's where you really that's where you're going to need Judkins to really excel, come out of that bye week healthy, get right out of that 2-week break. Then they get Auburn. Ole Miss gets Auburn, Vanderbilt, Texas A&M, and then all of a sudden they get Georgia in week 11. And that's the one game that you're going to really have to work around if you have Quinshaw Judkins and you're in a head-to-head league. Because in some leagues, that week 11 is going to be the first round of the playoffs. You need to try to figure out and start planning around that week 11 matchup on the road at Georgia right now, because the weeks 12 and 13, if he's healthy and doing 2022 things at the end of this year, they get Louisiana Monroe and Mississippi State to end the year. Two great matchups that Judkins really can propel you to some sort of a fantasy title as your running back one. I think you really just got to survive the next couple of weeks and the bye week. I think he'll be okay. Hopefully he comes out of that bye week extremely healthy. And then you get a really good 3-week run of Auburn, Vanderbilt, Texas A&M before that stumbling block in week 11 against Georgia. And then hopefully you're in the fantasy playoffs still at that point, and you get a matchup against Louisiana Monroe and Mississippi State to end the year. And that would be really sweet. So look, that's going to do it. I think I addressed all the questions right there on the buy, sell, hold. I went a little bit longer than I thought I was going to go. But that's going to do it, guys. Buy, sell, hold coming out of week 4, going into week 5. If you're in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League, try to get that. I'm going to try to get all of those brackets updated. We started the head-to-head format this past week. The Eliminator will come up and start this week. The two halves tournament is already 3/4 of the way through. We're moving into the final weeks of that before it resets and we get into the second half of the two halves tournament. So a lot coming up in the 4-1 Super Fantasy League. Be glued in. The links are on the homepage of the site. You can check all the brackets there. But that's going to do it, guys. For week 4 weeks are in the books. For a lot of you guys, by next week, half of the college fantasy football season is going to be over. You've got to start making plans from this point now on to kind of build your roster for the second half of the season and make that run. I know some of you guys are going to get a little desperate. If some of you guys are sitting in a good spot, here's a chance and an opportunity to make some deals with some guys that might be a little desperate. And if you're desperate, that's no knock. You have to be at this particular point. You have to be a little bit more riskier, and you have to be willing to gamble a little bit with losing a good player in hopes you get some immediate dividends to improve your status where you're at in the standings to make a run late in the year. So that's going to do it, guys. I'll see you guys after week 5, but that's going to do it for week 4. Good luck this week, and I'll see you guys next week. Till then.